Welcome to Self-Love Actually, a podcast that will provide guidance and support along your self-love journey. I'm your host, Hailey Curtis, a self-love life coach who helps people better love themselves by creating a life they dream of living. My purpose in creating this podcast is that it allows you to love yourself a little more, each and every episode. Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of Self-Love Actually. I figured today would be a good episode to just do by myself, switch it up, have a solo dolo episode and see how it goes. And what I really wanted to talk about today is self-compassion. Before I get into it, I just want to explain my recording situation right now because I am cramped in my closet because that is what my production partner suggested. Thank you, Peter at Pinto. And of course, I have Noodle, my dog, in here. Like, it definitely complicates things because I have to worry about him moving and making sound because the littlest of noise will be picked up by this mic. But I don't know why. I feel like he's my good luck charm. And like, if I don't have him with me, I'm not going to be able to, I don't know what, but here I am in my closet. It's not a big closet. I've got like a stool and like a TV table set up for my laptop and the mic. I've got Noodle in his bed to eliminate any sort of noises. So Noodle has been in all of my podcasts so far. So I feel like at this point, I've like committed to having him with me. So here we are in my closet, and I'll make sure to take a picture and post it on my story. Back to self-compassion. Self-compassion has changed my life. I've always known about it, but I didn't know what exactly it was. I thought it was just like being nice to yourself. And I know I've shared in the previous episode I recorded how I talked really poorly to myself. My inner dialogue was just such a bully. I would curse at myself over the smallest thing, and I was highly critical of every action I took. Even if it was as simple as like including myself in a conversation with a group of people, I would like second guess everything I said out loud, and my inner voice would make me feel like I was an idiot just because like I included myself in a conversation with a group of people. My inner voice really made me feel like it made me believe that I was an idiot who didn't deserve to be including myself in conversations. I made a conscious choice to be nicer to myself. And it helped, but what radically has changed my life was when I discovered what self-compassion really was. That's what I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to share with you what self-compassion is and what it's not, because it's not just being a cheerleader and being nice to yourself and giving yourself what you want. Like, self-compassion is very strategic, and I'm excited to kind of get into it. But before I do, I'd like to give credit to Dr. Kristin Neff for the information I'll be sharing in this podcast. Dr. Neff is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's spent a lot of time researching self-compassion and actually has 2 books and a workbook about it. I will make sure to link those resources in the show notes below. Kristin Neff has been a huge influence on me around self-compassion. So first, let's just think of regular, good old compassion. Compassion is initiated when you notice that suffering is present and then feel moved by that suffering to the point of where your heart responds to that pain. You may feel understanding and kindness towards this hardship and realize that suffering is part of the human experience. Self-compassion is applying the same reaction, but to yourself. Both compassion and self-compassion start with you noticing that the suffering is present. So once you've identified the suffering, then you can implement these 3 elements to self-compassion. The first step is practicing self-kindness towards your hardship. Showing yourself kindness to your suffering, failures, or feeling inadequate. You have to realize that these things are inevitable. And there is no need to ignore the pain that comes with failure. Instead, show kindness towards that pain. You may not ignore the pain, but experience these negative thoughts that pop up in your brain. We may not be able to control the self-judgmental and critical thoughts when we are at a low, but what you can control is how you respond to them. You can stop them from going further by responding to those thoughts with kindness. For example, when I was talking to myself really poorly and these thoughts would just pop up, I didn't have control of what would pop up in my brain. I did have control of how I responded to them. And instead of believing that I was an idiot for participating in a group conversation, I could really respond to that with kindness and be like, you know what? That's really not true. Just because you're including yourself in a conversation, you have every right to do that. There's a difference when you're able to respond to these thoughts instead of letting them control you. We can be our worst enemies at times. The next time you find yourself criticizing or judging yourself, really try to intentionally stop yourself and respond with kindness. For example, I can't believe you just said that. Now they're going to think X, Y, Z about you. Hey, listen, we're really trying hard not to talk to ourselves like that anymore. You are allowed to speak freely. If these people don't accept you for who you are, they don't deserve to be around you. Or here's another example. If you catch yourself saying, I can't believe how much weight I've gained. I can't even look at myself in the mirror. Stop, respond with kindness and say, hey, listen, weight is just a number. Unless it's detrimental to your health, it's okay for your weight to ebb and flow from time to time. Don't be so hard on yourself. Inner beauty is way more important than outer beauty. A really good way to tap into this kindness is channeling your inner child. Think of a younger version of yourself that was so vulnerable and impressionable. What would you tell that version of yourself if they were being judgmental? You talk to them with kindness. I always picture my 8-year-old self. I remember being so ready to be an adult, but yet there were things in the real world that terrified me. I find these fears will sometimes pop up today, and I have to turn towards that inner 8-year-old girl inside me and show her kindness and compassion. Growing up, I was convinced that my parents would die in their sleep. I created a lot of resistance around sleep in my childhood that's really carried into my adulthood. Today, when I have trouble falling asleep because of anxious thoughts, I try to channel my inner child if I can really think of it. I think, what would 8-year-old Hailey need to hear right now? Usually it's something along the lines of, I am safe and I am safe to fall asleep right now. It actually happened the other night. I was fighting sleep because I was convinced that my dog Noodle was going to die when I was on vacation. It took me a while to get to this point that I'm about to say, but I ended up telling myself, Hailey, listen, we don't need to be thinking about this right now. You really need to sleep so you can have a great day tomorrow. Let's choose to think about something else right now. Before I got to that point, it was probably 30 minutes to an hour of me thinking about the worst case scenario happening to Noodle when I was on vacation. So I was almost sabotaging myself in a way of thinking of all these things that weren't going to happen or most likely are not going to happen. And so I had to force myself to think of something else like that. Hey, listen, we don't need to be thinking about this right now. You need to sleep. So let's choose to think about something else. I thought of something else and I fell right back asleep. If I didn't have these tools of applying self-compassion, I probably would have battled sleep for a few more hours and judged myself along the way. If you've ever had trouble falling asleep, you know how it is. You get pissed at yourself because you need to be sleeping, but you're awake. And it's just this battle that goes back and forth, back and forth. So being able to channel this self-compassion really gave me what I needed in that moment. And I was able to fall back asleep. If the inner child thing does not fit for you, try imagining a relative, best friend, significant other going through what you're going through. Like, what would you tell them? And what kind words would you soothe them to let them know that they're safe? How would you respond to their failures or critical words? Do what you have to do to really be genuine with this self-kindness. When you allow your mind to spiral with self-criticism and judgment because of your suffering actually increases. When you combat your suffering with self-kindness, there becomes a mental calmness, and your mind isn't trying to fight itself anymore. So that is the very first element of self-compassion, which is self-kindness. The second is common humanity. After first having awareness of the suffering and then treating it with kindness, then you need to acknowledge you're not alone. We can feel so alone in our problems. I don't know about you, but when I'm on a low, I literally feel like I'm the only person in the world experiencing this problem. So much so that I shut down and isolate myself. I don't want to talk to anyone, barely want to eat. I feel so lonely about my problems, and I go into this like self-pity spiral. And if you've experienced this too, you have to realize that suffering is a part of the human experience. Everyone suffers. Although we may have different reasons that cause the suffering, everyone feels suffering the same. Here's an example of how you can put this into action. So let's use my recent sleep example. After showing kindness to myself, I could have said, Hailey, you're not alone with this. Many people have anxious thoughts keeping them up at night. It sucks, but you will get through this. You still want to channel that inner child or whatever source you're channeling in order to show yourself self-compassion. Letting yourself know that you are not alone and knowing that this suffering is the exact thing that makes you human. Just because you're suffering, it's really something that is so shared across the population. And so really feeling isolated is only going to make your suffering worse. When you're able to really realize that this suffering is part of the shared human experience, you feel less alone and you don't feel as isolated because it's something everyone experiences. So the third element of self-compassion is mindfulness. Mindfulness is observing your thoughts and feelings with no judgment, just as they are. This element really keeps your emotions in check because it keeps you from getting caught up in your feelings. You're observing with kindness instead of reacting or suppressing. I'm going to go back to that sleep example. It's super frustrating when you can't sleep and you feel like you're wasting this precious time. You may be thinking about how it's taking energy from your next day. Like these thoughts can go on and on and on. But when you practice mindfulness, you're just noticing and identifying emotions. It's almost like you're taking a back seat in the car and watching your emotions drive the car. Like, oh, yes, I'm frustrated, tired, and annoyed that I can't go to sleep. This helps you stay grounded because when you're able to observe, it really keeps you from going down a rabbit hole and preventing a negative reactivity. Because we cannot show compassion towards ourselves if we ignore or downplay our pain. Instead, we need to be mindful of it. That way we can observe from a neutral perspective. Okay, one last time I'll use the sleep example that incorporates all three of these components. Because self-compassion, like I said, it's not just one of these. It's literally all three of these things. You've got to show yourself self-kindness. You've got to translate your pain to common humanity that connects all of us. Like what you've experienced, what you're going through is something that someone in this world has also experienced. And then also the third one is mindfulness. So being aware of your emotions so you're able to realize that you're suffering and you need to implement compassion. Okay, so here's that sleep example. So I'm struggling to fall asleep and I find myself getting frustrated. And then I remember there's self-compassion. So I tell myself, Hailey, this sucks. I know you feel frustrated, annoyed, and tired, but please know you're not alone with this. Many people experience anxious thoughts that keep them up from falling asleep. We don't need to be thinking about this right now. What can you intentionally think of instead that will help you fall back asleep? So that is self-compassion. This example wasn't really hardcore suffering, but it's a great example of how self-compassion can be applied to any sort of internal struggle. My favorite thing about self-compassion is that it's always available for you to use. You can always turn to self-compassion. It's just a matter of actually remembering to use it and implement it. And remember, like most acts of self-love, self-compassion is a practice. It will require you to be intentional about creating more of it in your life. And only you can do that for yourself. Research has actually proven that self-compassion is related to mental well-being, such as less depression, less stress, less perfectionism. It's proven happiness, life satisfaction, motivation, and improving interpersonal relationships. Self-compassion is just honestly the best thing ever. And if you really try and implement it into your life, you will see such a big improvement. I do want to get into what self-compassion is not, because it is not self-pity. It is not just pitying yourself. Oh, poor you. You have this problem. You're suffering. No. Self-pity comes from a place where you feel like you're the only one going through the problem. And that's not the case, because the second component of self-compassion is common humanity, interconnectedness, knowing that you are not alone through these problems. So acknowledging that you're suffering is the exact thing that connects us to other people. So although your circumstances are different, everyone experiences suffering. Self-compassion is not self-pity. Self-compassion is also not self-indulgent. It's not if you're having a bad day. Self-compassion is not taking a break or eating a whole pint of ice cream because you want to. Self-compassion affirms and acknowledges, damn, you're having a bad day and I know it sucks, but no, you're not alone, and everyone has bad days. And you've made it through 100% of your worst days, and you'll make it through this one too. Showing yourself that kindness and incorporating the other steps of self-compassion, which are common humanity and mindfulness. Being open-hearted to yourself allows you to be open-hearted to others. And self-compassion is not toxic positivity. And if you're not familiar with toxic positivity, it is reinforcing a positive state of mind in a not so positive situation. If you got in a car accident and you're like, yeah, I'll be okay. It's all good. No, it's not all good. You just got in a car accident. You need to be mindful of the emotions that are actually happening in your brain and affirm yes, this sucks. And then show yourself that kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. Self-compassion responds to suffering by acknowledging the negative circumstances and giving yourself grace and compassion to get through it. Also, self-compassion is not self-esteem. There is no doubt that a low self-esteem can be detrimental to your mental health, but having a high self-esteem is not the same as self-compassion, because when you have a high self-esteem, it really puts you on a pedestal. High self-esteem makes you kind of feel like you're better than everyone else and that you're different and you're special. And there's no doubt that you have special qualities, but it takes away from the interconnectedness that self-compassion offers. And acknowledging that there is someone else in this world experiencing the same problem as you, or experiencing on the other side the same success as you. There's always going to be someone experiencing the same. So you really don't want to put yourself up or down. Self-esteem can go high or low. But having a high self-esteem encourages us to be better than others in order to feel better about ourselves. So self-esteem asks, how am I different from others? Where self-compassion asks, how am I similar to others? So before I got into self-compassion, I took a test. Yes, there is a self-compassion test out there. It is put on by Kristin Neff, the queen of self-compassion, and the scale ranges from 0 to 5. And it's just a series of questions that touch on these 3 components of self-compassion, which are self-kindness, interconnectedness, and mindfulness. And so when I first took the test, like I said, it was before I started my self-compassion practice, I ranked as a 2.27, which is less than average. Looking back, that was probably about right. I remember taking it and thinking like, wow, not even half. Like, what the hell? Like, I've got some work to do. But like I said, my inner dialogue was trash, and self-compassion has really, really helped. And as I was like writing the notes for this podcast, I was like, let me take that test again so I can like see. I haven't taken the test since then. So I took the test again and I got a 4.3. I went from a 2.27 to a 4.3 just from practicing self-compassion and practicing these elements of self-compassion in my life. So it really goes to show you that the practice of self-compassion really works, and it will implement your life for the better if you choose to do so. I encourage you to take the test too, just to see where you're at with your self-compassion and see if it's something you need to work on. You can find the link to the test in the show notes below. Before I wrap up, I do want to just do a little recap of how to practice self-compassion. First of all, you've got to be aware of your suffering. You got to know that it's present. And then you have to treat that suffering or pain with kindness. So channeling that kind voice that you would show towards your inner child, best friend, sibling, partner, whoever that is for you, and really being genuine with that kindness. Once you're done with the kindness, then you need to realize that your feelings of suffering are shared by most people. Know that you are not alone. And this part's going to really be hard because your brain's going to really try and convince you like, nope, you're the only one, you're suffering. And that's why it takes such practice to really implement these things, because you have to be intentional. You have to realize that these things are going on, and then you have to like actively tell your brain something else. So know that you're not alone. And then third, take a back seat to your emotions and feelings and observe without judgment. Observing with kindness and grace instead of just reacting or suppressing. That is it for this episode of Self-Compassion. If you're interested in more practices of self-compassion, I highly recommend reading Kristin Neff's books. She has 2 outstanding books on self-compassion. One is called Self-Compassion, and that's the one I've read, and it's awesome. And the other is called Fierce Self-Compassion. I have yet to read it, but it is on my list. So if you don't want to commit to a book, I recommend watching her talks on YouTube. You'd get a lot out of it. You can just play it after this, listen to it like a podcast. I will link all of these resources below for you to check out. And I hope that this episode gave you some more insight to what self-compassion is and isn't. And I hope to see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening, self-lovers. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know by leaving a review and subscribing to this podcast. And if you really loved it, please share this episode with a friend. This episode wouldn't have been possible without our production partner, Pinto Media. Making this podcast has been so easy with their help. If you're thinking of starting a podcast on your own, check out their page on Instagram at produced_by_Pinto, Pinto. If you're ready to level up your self-love game outside of this podcast, you can book a free clarity call with me to see if we would be a good fit for one another. I help my clients achieve their goals fueled by self-love. You can head to my website, HaileyCurtis.com, or check out the show notes below. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me about future episodes, please email me at hello@HaileyCurtis.com or DM me on Instagram at @IamHaileyCurtis. I really want to make sure that these episodes best serve you. That is it for today, self-lovers. I will meet you again on our next episode.